I hadn't planned to stay long at my stepfather's house. It was supposed to be a weekend visit, 2 days to see my mother, collect a few old things, and then return to the life I had built in the city with Lucas. But the moment I stepped inside that familiar hallway, with its faded family photos and the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, I felt something loosen inside me. As if I had walked into a version of myself I had been avoiding. My name is Ethan, and at 22, I thought I had finally figured out who I was. I had a boyfriend, a job, and a future that at least looked stable from the outside. Lucas and I had been together for almost a year. Long enough for routines to form, long enough for silence to feel heavier than words. He worked late, always chasing deadlines, always exhausted. Our conversations had slowly turned into updates instead of connections: what he ate, where he went, what time he'd be home. We still said, "I love you," but lately it felt more like a habit than a feeling. The real reason I came back home was that I felt invisible. Not just to Lucas, but to myself. My mother, Maya, opened the door with the same warm smile she'd had my entire life. She hugged me tightly, as if I were still 16 instead of a grown man pretending he didn't need comfort. "You look tired," she said, pulling back to study my face. "I'm fine," I replied automatically. It was easier than explaining everything I didn't understand. Daniel stood behind her, leaning casually against the wall. My stepfather had always been quiet, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He'd been in my life since I was 14, long enough to feel permanent but distant enough that we had never been truly close. "Hey, Ethan," he said, offering a small smile. "Hey," I answered, surprised by how calm his presence felt. The house was quieter than I remembered. My mother had taken fewer shifts at work, and Daniel worked from home most days. There was a stillness in the air, not uncomfortable, just empty. Like something had been paused. That evening, after dinner, my mother went to bed early, exhausted from her day. I stayed in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, waiting for a message from Lucas that never came. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat across from me. "You've been staring at that screen for a while," he said gently. That I shrugged. "Just tired." He nodded, but didn't push. That was something I noticed about him: he never demanded answers. He just made space. For a moment, we sat in silence, the kind that usually makes me anxious. But with Daniel, it felt different. Comfortable. "Safe, city life treating you well?" he asked. That I hesitated. "It's busy." That doesn't sound like an answer. I laughed quietly. "Guess not." The truth was, I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. I wasn't unhappy, exactly. I just felt disconnected, from Lucas, from my choices, from the version of myself I kept pretending to be. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You know, sometimes being busy is just a way of avoiding things." The words landed deeper than I expected. "Avoiding what?" I asked. That he looked at me for a moment, thoughtful. "Whatever it is you don't want to admit out loud." I didn't respond. Because I didn't know the answer. Or maybe I did, and that scared me more. That night, lying in my old bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and thought about Lucas. About how I used to miss him when he wasn't around, and how lately I felt more lonely when he was. I checked my phone one last time before sleeping. Still no message. The next morning, Daniel and I were the only ones awake. My mother had left early for work, and the house felt even quieter than before. He was making coffee, moving around the kitchen with an ease that made the space feel lived in again. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Better than I expected." We sat together at the table, drinking coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the curtains. It was such a simple moment, but I felt more present than I had in weeks. "So," Daniel said, "how are things really going with Lucas?" I looked up at him, surprised. No one ever asked me that directly. "They're fine," I said instinctively. He didn't react, just waited. I sighed. "I don't know. I feel like I'm always the one reaching out. Like I'm in a relationship by myself." Daniel nodded slowly. "That can be exhausting." "It is," I admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if he even notices when I'm not around." The words felt heavier once spoken, but also strangely relieving. Daniel's voice was calm. People notice more than they show. But that doesn't mean they show it in the ways we need. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. In that moment, sitting across from him in the quiet kitchen of my childhood home, I felt something shift. Not attraction. Not desire. Just a sense of being seen. Truly seen. And I had no idea that this feeling, this simple emotional connection, was the first step toward a line I didn't yet know I was about to cross. After that morning, I began noticing how often I gravitated toward Daniel without meaning to. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. It just felt easier to be around him. When my mother was at work and the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself sitting in the living room instead of my bedroom, pretending to read while Daniel worked on his laptop across the table. We didn't talk much at first. But somehow, the silence between us felt different from the silence I shared with Lucas. With Lucas, silence meant distance. With Daniel, it felt like understanding without effort. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Lucas. Sorry, busy day. Call you later. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying, okay. That was all I wrote. No questions. No complaints. I didn't even feel angry anymore. Just tired. Daniel looked up from his screen. Everything okay? Yeah, I said, then corrected myself. Not really. He closed his laptop, giving me his full attention. You want to talk about it? I hesitated. There was a strange urge in me, to be honest, in a way I hadn't been with anyone in a long time. I feel like I'm slowly disappearing from my own relationship, I said. Like I'm there, but I don't matter as much anymore. Daniel didn't interrupt. He let me continue. Lucas used to ask how I was feeling. Now he just tells me how tired he is. I know he's stressed, but sometimes I feel like I'm just another task on his schedule. Daniel exhaled softly. That's a lonely place to be. I looked at him, surprised by how accurately he had named it. Lonely. That was exactly it. He paused for a moment before speaking again. You know, marriage isn't so different. People think it's about staying together, but it's really about staying connected. And that's harder than it sounds. I hadn't expected him to open up about his own life. You and my mom, are you happy? I asked carefully. Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. We care about each other. But sometimes caring turns into coexisting. You share space, responsibilities, routines, but not always feelings. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just honesty. I nodded slowly. That sounds familiar. From that day on, our conversations became more personal. We talked about fears, about choices, about the versions of ourselves we had once imagined becoming. I told him about moving to the city, about how freeing it felt to live openly as a gay man, and how terrifying it still was to admit I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Daniel listened in a way that made me feel important. Not interesting. Not entertaining. Important. One evening, I sat on the back porch while he watered the plants. The sky was darkening, painted in deep shades of orange and blue. Do you ever feel like you missed a different life? I asked suddenly. He paused, the hose still running. Sometimes, he admitted. Not because I regret what I have. But because I wonder who I'd be if I had made different choices. I swallowed. I feel like I'm standing between two versions of myself. The one I'm living, and the one I might become. Daniel turned off the water and sat beside me. And you don't know which one is real yet. Exactly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I became acutely aware of how close he was sitting, how his shoulder almost brushed mine. I shifted slightly, creating space. Not because I felt uncomfortable, but because I felt too comfortable. That night, Lucas finally called. I answered from my bedroom, keeping my voice low. Hey, he said. Sorry I didn't call earlier. It's fine, I replied, though it wasn't entirely true that he talked about work for 10 minutes straight. I listened, nodded, made the right sounds at the right moments. When he finally asked, "How are you?" it felt like an afterthought. "I'm okay," I said. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't mention how seen I felt. I didn't mention that for the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for Lucas's attention anymore. After we hung up, I realized something that unsettled me. I hadn't missed him during the call. I had been thinking about what Daniel had said earlier, about missed lives and unchosen paths. The next morning, Daniel asked if I wanted to go for a walk. Just around the neighborhood. Nothing special. As we walked, side by side, I felt a quiet awareness growing inside me. Not attraction in the physical sense, not desire in any way I could clearly define. It was something subtler and more dangerous, a reliance. An emotional leaning. The kind that forms before you realize you're already off balance. That I was starting to tell him things I didn't tell Lucas. I was starting to look forward to his presence more than my boyfriend's messages, and somewhere deep inside, a part of me knew the truth before I was ready to admit it. Nothing physical had happened. Nothing inappropriate had been said, but emotionally, I was already standing in the wrong place, pretending I hadn't crossed a line that I no longer knew how to step back from. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as discomfort. I felt it when I woke up one morning and checked my phone, not for a message from Lucas, but to see if Daniel was already awake. I felt it when I heard my mother's car pull into the driveway, and my first instinct was to retreat into my room, as if I were hiding something that had never been spoken aloud. That was when I understood, the problem wasn't what had happened. It was what was happening inside me. Daniel and I were sitting in the living room that afternoon, the television on but muted. He was scrolling through his laptop, and I was pretending to read, though I hadn't absorbed a single word for the last 10 minutes. "Ethan," he said suddenly. "Yeah." He closed the laptop and turned toward me. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I nodded, already uneasy. "Do you think we're leaning on each other too much?" The question landed directly on the thought I'd been trying to avoid. I stared at the floor for a moment before answering. I think I've been using you to escape something." Daniel didn't look offended. He looked relieved. "So have I." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable this time. It was heavy, filled with everything we hadn't said. "I care about you," he continued carefully. "But I don't think this is healthy. Not for you. Not for me. And definitely not for your mother." Hearing Maya's name out loud felt like a sharp reminder of reality. I felt a wave of guilt rush through me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. "I never meant for this to happen," I said. "I didn't plan it." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's what makes it dangerous. Emotional things rarely feel wrong until they already are." That night, I called Lucas again. This time, I didn't wait for him to ask how I was. "There's something I need to tell you," I said as soon as he picked up. That he sounded tired, but attentive. "Okay. What's going on?" I took a deep breath. "I think I've been emotionally distant. And not just because of work or stress. I've been talking to someone else. Not romantically, not physically, but in a way that feels wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Who?" Lucas asked quietly. "My stepfather." "Daniel." Another silence, heavier than the first. Lucas finally spoke. "Are you in love with him?" The question shocked me. "No," I said quickly. "I don't think so. It's not like that. But I've been going to him for things I should have been sharing with you." Lucas exhaled slowly. "So you emotionally cheated." The word hurt more than I expected, because it was true. I didn't touch him. I didn't even think about him that way. But I relied on him. I chose him when I felt lonely instead of coming to you. Lucas's voice softened, but it was filled with disappointment. "That still breaks trust, Ethan. Maybe not in the obvious way, but in the quiet one." "I know," I whispered. "And I'm sorry. We didn't argue. There was no shouting, no dramatic ending. Just a calm, painful conversation about distance, unmet needs, and how easy it is to lose each other without realizing it's happening." when the call ended, I felt empty. Not relieved. Not healed. Just aware. The next morning, I found Daniel in the kitchen again. The routine felt different now, stripped of the comfort it once held. I told Lucas, I said. Daniel looked at me, his expression serious. And he was hurt. But he deserved to know. Daniel nodded. So did I. We stood there for a moment, both aware that something had shifted permanently. I think I should leave today, I added. Daniel didn't try to stop me. That might be the right choice. As I packed my bag, my mother called from work, asking if I'd be staying another night. I told her I had to go back to the city. She sounded disappointed, but understanding. Before I left, Daniel and I stood by the front door. I'm glad you came home, he said. But I'm even more glad you realized this before it went further. Me too, I replied. I don't want to become someone who hurts people without meaning to. He gave a small, sincere smile. Awareness is a good place to start. On the train back to the city, I watched the landscape blur past the window and thought about everything I had learned in just a few days. About how emotional closeness can be just as powerful as physical intimacy. About how easy it is to cross invisible boundaries when you're lonely. About how love, if not nurtured, doesn't disappear, it just gets replaced. That I didn't know what would happen with Lucas. I didn't know if our relationship could be repaired. And I didn't know what distance from Daniel would feel like in the long run, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever I had gone looking for at my stepfather's house, I hadn't found love. That I had found a mirror, and for the first time, I was forced to look honestly at the person I was becoming, and decide whether I was willing to change before losing everything that truly mattered.